The lobby of the Grand Imperial Hotel in Vienna was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with angels and clouds. The marble floors were so polished you could see your own reflection in them. Men in expensive suits walked past carrying briefcases worth more than most people's cars. Women in designer dresses sipped champagne near the grand staircase, their laughter echoing through the massive space like wind chimes made of gold. This was not a place for someone like Elena Vasquez. She stood near the entrance, clutching a worn leather handbag that had belonged to her mother. Her coat was old but clean. Her shoes were comfortable, the kind a woman wears when she has spent her whole life on her feet. At 67 years old, Elena had the kind of face that told stories without speaking. Deep lines around her eyes, hands that had known hard work. Gray hair pulled back in a simple bun. She looked like what she was, a retired housekeeper from a small town in Argentina, who had never traveled beyond her own country until 3 weeks ago. This trip to Europe was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. Her granddaughter, Sophia, had moved to Vienna 2 years earlier to study music at the university. Elena had saved for years to make this journey. Every extra coin, every small job on the side, all of it went into a jar she kept hidden in her closet. And finally, at an age when most people stay home and wait for the end, Elena had done something brave. She had gotten on an airplane for the first time in her life and flown halfway around the world to see the only family she had left. But Sophia's classes were running late today. So Elena had wandered into this hotel to escape the cold December air outside. She just wanted to sit somewhere warm for a few minutes. She did not expect what would happen next. The concierge behind the front desk noticed her immediately. He was a thin man with slicked back hair and a nose that seemed permanently pointed upward. His eyes traveled over Elena's simple clothes, her worn shoes, her weathered face. His expression changed from professional politeness to something colder, something dismissive. He did not approach her. He did not offer help. He simply watched, as if waiting for her to realize she did not belong here and leave on her own. Elena felt his gaze. She had felt that kind of look many times in her life. The look that said you are not one of us. The look that measured your worth by the clothes you wore and the money in your pocket. She had learned long ago not to let such looks bother her. People who judged others by appearances rarely had anything meaningful to offer anyway. So she ignored him. Instead, her attention was drawn to something else entirely. Near the grand staircase, roped off with velvet barriers, sat the most beautiful piano Elena had ever seen. It was a Bissendorfer Imperial Grand, its black surface gleaming under the chandelier light like still water at midnight. The keys were pristine, untouched, waiting. A small sign stood beside it on a golden stand. The words were in German and English, reserved for tonight's charity gala, professional musicians only. Elena stopped walking. Her breath caught in her throat. Something shifted behind her eyes. Something old. Something buried so deep she had almost forgotten it existed. Her hands, resting at her sides, trembled slightly. Not from cold. Not from age? From something else entirely. She stood there for a long moment, just looking at the piano. The noise of the lobby seemed to fade away. The clinking glasses. The murmured conversations. The clicking heels on marble. All of it became distant, like sounds heard through water. A group of wealthy guests nearby noticed her staring. A woman in a red dress leaned toward her husband and whispered something. They both looked at Elena and smiled in that way people smile when they find something amusing. A cleaning lady admiring something she could never have. How adorable. How sad Elena did not notice them. Her eyes never left the piano. Memories she had locked away for decades began to stir. The smell of her childhood home in Buenos Aires, the sound of her teacher's voice, gentle but demanding. The feeling of keys beneath her fingers when she was young, and the whole world seemed full of possibility. The dreams she once had. The life she almost lived, all of it came flooding back in the space of a heartbeat. She took a step closer to the piano. Then another. She was not even aware she was moving. It was as if something was pulling her forward, Some invisible thread connecting her to that instrument, the concierge finally decided to act. He stepped out from behind his desk and walked toward her with quick, purposeful steps. His shoes clicked sharply against the marble. "Excuse me, madam," he said, his voice polite but cold. "May I help you with something?" Elena blinked, suddenly aware of where she was. She turned to face him. "I am waiting for my granddaughter," she said in careful English. Her accent was thick, her words slow, chosen with effort. "She studies at the university, music?" The concierge nodded, but his expression did not soften. "I see. Perhaps you would be more comfortable waiting outside? There is a cafe across the street." Elena understood what he was really saying. "You do not belong here. Please leave," but before she could respond, a younger man appeared beside the concierge. He was perhaps 30 years old, wearing a hotel manager's uniform with a name tag that read Klaus. He had the confident smile of someone who had never been told no in his life. "Is there a problem here, Heinrich?" Klaus asked, looking at Elena with curiosity. "This woman is waiting for someone," the concierge replied. "I suggested she might be more comfortable elsewhere." Klaus studied Elena for a moment. Then his eyes followed her earlier gaze to the piano. A small smile played at the corner of his lips. "Do you like the piano?" he asked her. Elena nodded slowly. "It is beautiful. Do you play?" The question hung in the air. Simple words. 2 syllables. But they carried a weight that no one in that lobby could possibly understand. Elena hesitated. Something flickered across her face. Pain, memory, loss, and beneath all of it, something that might have been longing. "A little," she said quietly. "A long time ago." Klaus exchanged a glance with the concierge. That small smile on his face grew wider. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had just thought of a joke. "Well then," Klaus said, gesturing toward the piano with a grand sweep of his arm. "Why don't you play something for us? We could use some entertainment while we prepare for tonight's event." A few guests nearby turned to watch. Some of them chuckled. The woman in the red dress covered her mouth with her hand, eyes sparkling with amusement. "Oh, I do not think... Elena began. "Please, I insist," Klaus interrupted. He walked over to the velvet rope and unhooked it with a flourish. "Nothing too complicated, of course. Maybe something simple. A children's song, perhaps? Twinkle, twinkle, little star?" Laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. The concierge shook his head slightly, embarrassed by the whole scene. Elena looked at the piano, then at the laughing faces around her, then back at the piano. Her expression was impossible to read. Was she humiliated? Angry? Afraid? No one could tell. Without saying another word, she walked slowly toward the bench. Her worn shoes made no sound on the marble floor. She set her old handbag on the ground beside her. She sat down, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. The lobby grew quiet. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. They expected to laugh. They expected a few clumsy notes, an embarrassed old woman, a story to tell at dinner parties. They had no idea what they were about to witness. Elena closed her eyes. She took a single deep breath, and she placed her weathered hands on the keys. For a moment, nothing happened. Elena sat perfectly still at the piano bench, her eyes closed, her hands resting on the keys without pressing them. The silence stretched out, long and uncomfortable. Klaus crossed his arms and leaned against a marble pillar, that smug smile still playing on his lips. The concierge shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly wishing this awkward scene would end quickly. The guests who had gathered to watch whispered among themselves, already preparing their jokes about the confused old woman who did not know what she was doing. 5 seconds passed. Then 10, the woman in the red dress giggled nervously. "Perhaps she forgot how to play," she whispered to her husband. Loud enough for others to hear, more laughter. Elena did not react. She did not open her eyes. She did not move. It was as if she had traveled somewhere far away, somewhere none of them could follow. Her breathing was slow and deep. Her face had become completely calm, almost peaceful. Then something changed. Her fingers moved. Just slightly at first. A gentle press against the keys so soft it barely made a sound. Then another. And another. Single notes, scattered like the first drops of rain before a storm. The laughter in the lobby began to fade. People tilted their heads, trying to understand what they were hearing. These were not the clumsy sounds of an amateur. These notes had intention. They had purpose. They were building toward something. And then Elena truly began to play the opening bars of Chopin's Ballade. No, one in G minor poured from the piano like water breaking through a dam. The sound filled every corner of the massive lobby. It climbed up to the painted ceiling with its angels and clouds. It wrapped around the crystal chandeliers. It silenced every voice, stopped every movement, froze every heart. Klaus's smile vanished. His arms dropped to his sides. His mouth fell open slightly. The concierge grabbed the edge of his desk to steady himself. His face had gone pale. The woman in the red dress was no longer laughing. Her champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. She did not even notice. No one noticed. Everyone in that lobby had stopped breathing because what they were witnessing was impossible. This was not a simple melody. This was not a children's song. This was one of the most difficult, most emotionally demanding pieces ever written for piano. Concert pianists spent years mastering it. Some never did. It required not just technical skill, but something deeper. Something that could not be taught. Something that had to live inside you, and Elena played it as if she had been born with it in her blood. Her fingers flew across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed inhuman. But it was not just the technique that stunned the crowd. It was the feeling. Every note carried weight. Every phrase told a story. The music was sometimes soft as a whisper, then suddenly powerful as thunder. It rose and fell like waves on the ocean, like joy and sorrow dancing together, like a lifetime of emotions compressed into sound. Elena's face had transformed. The tired old woman who had walked into the lobby was gone. In her place sat someone else entirely. Her expression shifted with the music. Pain, hope, loss, love, all of it moved across her features like clouds across the sky. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm. Her eyes remained closed, but tears had begun to slip down her weathered cheeks. She was not just playing the piano. She was speaking through it, telling a story that words could never capture. A businessman who had been rushing toward the elevator stopped in his tracks. His briefcase fell from his hand. He stood there, motionless, tears forming in his eyes even though he had no idea why. A young couple near the window held each other tightly. Overcome by emotions they could not name. An elderly man sitting alone in a leather chair lowered his newspaper. His hands were shaking. He recognized this piece. He had heard it performed by the greatest pianists in the world's finest concert halls. And somehow, this woman in her worn coat and comfortable shoes was playing it better than any of them. Klaus had not moved from his spot by the marble pillar. But he was no longer the confident young manager who had mocked an old woman for his own amusement. His face had crumbled. His eyes were wet. His hands hung limp at his sides. He looked like a man who had just discovered that everything he believed about the world was wrong. The music built toward its first climax. Elena's hands crashed down on the keys with devastating power. The sound exploded through the lobby like a thunderclap. Several people gasped. A woman near the back of the crowd let out a small cry. Then the music softened again. It became tender, fragile, like a heart that had been broken too many times but still dared to hope. Elena played these passages with such gentleness that it felt like watching someone hold a wounded bird in their hands. More people had gathered now. Staff members had emerged from back rooms, drawn by the music. Guests had come down from their rooms, standing on the balconies above to watch. A chef in his white uniform stood in the doorway to the restaurant, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the old woman at the piano. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt this moment. The concierge, Heinrich, found himself thinking about his mother. She had died 3 years ago. He had been too busy with work to visit her in her final weeks. The regret had been eating at him ever since. And now, somehow, this music was pulling that grief out of him. Tears streamed down his thin face. He did not try to hide them. The woman in the red dress was sobbing openly. Her husband had his arm around her, but he was crying too. Whatever joke they had prepared to tell at dinner parties was forgotten. What they were experiencing now was not a joke. It was something sacred. Elena played on, lost in the music. For her, the lobby had disappeared. The watching crowd had disappeared. The years had disappeared. She was no longer 67 years old. She was no longer a retired housekeeper who had spent decades scrubbing floors and washing dishes. She was who she had always been, deep down, beneath all the pain and loss and silence. She was a pianist. A true pianist. And for the first time in over 40 years, she was finally playing again. The memories came flooding back as her fingers moved. Her teacher, Maestro Benedetti, sitting beside her at a battered old piano in Buenos Aires, nodding with approval. Her father, a factory worker who had saved for months to buy her first sheet music, standing in the doorway of their small home with tears of pride in his eyes. Her mother, humming along while she practiced, always believing that her daughter was destined for greatness. All of them were gone now. All of them had been gone for so long. But in this moment, through this music, they were with her again. She could feel them. She could hear them. She could love them. The piece moved into its most technically challenging section. Elena's hands seemed to multiply, playing passages so fast and complex that they should have been impossible for a woman her age. But she did not falter. Not once. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was exactly where it needed to be. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Some had their phones out, recording, but most had forgotten about their devices entirely. This was not something to be captured and shared. This was something to be experienced, to be present for, to be changed by. Klaus finally moved. He took 3 unsteady steps toward the piano. Then he stopped. He did not know what to do. He did not know what to say. He had invited this woman to play as a joke. He had expected to laugh at her. Instead, she had shattered something inside him. Some wall he had built around his heart without even realizing it. Elena approached the final section of the ballade. The music grew darker, more intense. It was building toward something. Everyone could feel it. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, and then, with one final cascade of notes that seemed to contain every human emotion at once, Elena brought the piece to its devastating conclusion. Her hands lifted from the keys. The last notes hung in the air for a long moment, then there was silence. Complete, absolute silence. Elena opened her eyes. She looked down at her hands, as if seeing them for the first time. Then she looked up at the crowd gathered around her, and the lobby erupted. The applause hit Elena like a wave. It came from everywhere at once. From the guests in their expensive clothes. From the staff members who had abandoned their posts. From the people leaning over the balconies above. From the strangers who had wandered in from the street, drawn by the music that had spilled out through the open doors. It was not polite applause. It was not the kind of clapping you do at the end of a speech because you feel you should. This was something else entirely. This was raw. This was real. This was the sound of people who had just witnessed something that had changed them. Elena sat frozen at the piano bench. Her hands were still raised slightly above the keys, trembling. She looked around the lobby with wide eyes, as if waking from a dream and finding herself in a strange land. For a moment, she seemed confused, lost, like she had forgotten where she was and how she had gotten there. The applause grew louder. People were standing now. Everyone was standing. The businessman who had dropped his briefcase. The elderly man with his newspaper. The young couple by the window. Even the concierge, Heinrich, was on his feet, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" Others joined in. The word echoed through the marble halls like a celebration. A woman rushed forward and knelt beside Elena. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," she managed to say. "Thank you. Thank you." Elena looked at her with gentle surprise. She reached out and touched the woman's cheek, wiping away a tear with her weathered thumb. She did not say anything. There were no words for this moment. More people approached. They wanted to shake her hand. They wanted to tell her what the music had made them feel. An older gentleman with white hair and kind eyes told her that his wife had loved Chopin. She had passed away 2 years ago. Hearing Elena play had brought her back to him, just for a moment. Just long enough to say goodbye. Elena listened to each person. She held their hands. She accepted their embraces. Her own tears had not stopped flowing, but she was smiling now. A real smile. The kind that comes from somewhere deep inside, from a place that had been dark for too long. Klaus stood apart from the crowd. He had not moved from his spot near the marble pillar. His face was a battlefield of emotions, shame, wonder, confusion. He kept running his hand through his hair. A nervous habit from childhood that he thought he had outgrown. He had spent his whole life judging people, sorting them into categories. Important and unimportant. Worthy and unworthy. He had looked at this old woman in her worn coat and comfortable shoes and decided in an instant that she was nobody, that she had nothing to offer, that she existed only to be the punchline of his joke. How wrong he had been. How terribly, completely wrong. The crowd around Elena began to part. People stepped aside, creating a path. Klaus did not understand why at first. Then he realized they were making room for him. They were waiting for him to approach. His feet felt heavy as he walked toward the piano. Each step was an effort. The distance was only 20 feet, but it felt like miles. He could feel everyone watching him, waiting to see what he would do. Elena looked up as he approached. Her eyes met his. There was no anger in her gaze, no accusation, no triumph. Just a quiet steadiness that made Klaus feel even smaller than he already did. He stopped in front of her. His mouth opened, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? What apology could ever be enough? Elena waited, patient, calm. Finally, Klaus found his voice. It came out cracked and rough, barely above a whisper. "I am so sorry," he said. "I am so deeply sorry. I had no right to speak to you the way I did. I had no right to mock you. I had no right to assume." His voice broke. He took a shaky breath. "I was cruel. I was arrogant. And I was wrong. Please forgive me." Elena studied his face for a long moment. She could see the sincerity in his eyes. She could see the shame. She could see that this was not just an apology for what he had done to her. This was something bigger. This was a man confronting an ugliness in himself that he had never acknowledged before. She reached out and took his hand in both of hers. Her grip was warm and surprisingly strong. "Young man," she said softly, "we all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." Klaus nodded, unable to speak. Tears spilled down his cheeks. He did not try to hide them. "Music does not care what you wear," Elena continued. "It does not care how much money you have. It does not care where you come from or what language you speak. Music only cares about the truth in your heart. Remember that." She released his hand and turned back to the piano. The crowd had grown even larger now. Word had spread through the hotel, out into the street, into the shops and cafes nearby. People were pushing through the doors, straining to see the old woman at the Bissendorfer Grand. Several people had their phones out, recording everything. One young man near the front had been filming since the moment Elena started playing Chopin. He had no idea that his video would change everything. He was just a tourist from Canada who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Someone in the crowd called out, "Please, will you play something else?" Others joined in. "Yes, please. One more piece. Anything you want." Elena hesitated. She looked down at her hands. They were still trembling slightly. She had not played in over 4 decades. The Chopin had taken everything out of her. Every emotion, every memory, every ounce of strength she had. But then she looked at the faces surrounding her. The hope in their eyes. The hunger. These people were not asking to be entertained. They were asking to be moved again. To feel something real in a world that so often felt fake, how could she say no to that? She turned back to the keys. The crowd fell silent instantly. Elena closed her eyes once more. She let her mind travel back through the years. Back to a small practice room in Buenos Aires. Back to a young girl with wild dreams and nimble fingers. Back to a piece she had played 1,000 times, but never in front of an audience. Never until today she began to play Liszt La Campanella. If Chopin had been a wave, this was a hurricane. The piece was legendary among pianists. It was considered one of the most difficult compositions ever written. The melody was deceptively simple, like church bells ringing in the distance. But beneath that melody lay a technical challenge so extreme that many professionals refused to attempt it. The jumps between notes were enormous. The speed required was inhuman. One tiny mistake would send the whole piece crashing down. Elena played it flawlessly. Her right hand leaped across the keyboard, striking notes that seemed impossibly far apart with impossible accuracy. Her left hand provided a foundation so solid it was like watching a dancer balance on air. The bells rang out through the lobby, clear and bright and beautiful. The crowd watched in disbelief. This was not supposed to be possible. An elderly woman who had not touched a piano in decades was performing at a level that most concert pianists could only dream of, but Elena was not thinking about difficulty. She was not thinking about technique. She was simply playing, the way she had played when she was young, before the world had taken everything from her. Before she had locked this part of herself away and thrown away the key, the music filled her completely. It filled the lobby. It filled the hearts of everyone who heard it, and somewhere across the ocean of time, a young girl with wild dreams smiled. She had never really gone away. She had just been waiting for this moment. Waiting to be free again, the piece built toward its final, impossible climax. Elena's fingers were a blur. The notes cascaded like a waterfall of light, and it was over. The last bell faded into silence. Elena lowered her hands, and this time, when the applause came, it shook the very walls of the Grand Imperial Hotel. The video was uploaded at 4:47 in the afternoon, Vienna time. By midnight, it had been viewed over 2 million times. By the next morning, that number had grown to 15 million. By the end of the week, it had crossed 80 million views and was still climbing. The young tourist from Canada who had filmed Elena's performance had titled it simply, "Old woman asked to play simple song. What happens next will leave you speechless." He had no idea how true those words would turn out to be. The video spread like wildfire across every corner of the internet. People shared it with their friends. News channels picked it up. Famous musicians watched it and posted their reactions, tears streaming down their faces. Piano teachers showed it to their students. Parents played it for their children at bedtime, trying to explain why mommy and daddy were crying. Comments poured in by the thousands. "Who is this woman?" people asked. "Where did she come from? How is this possible?" Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Everyone wanted to understand how an elderly woman in worn clothes could sit down at a piano in a hotel lobby and play, like one of the greatest musicians who ever lived. The journalist came next. They always do when a story captures the world's attention. Reporters from newspapers and television stations began digging into Elena's past, searching for answers. And what they found was a story so heartbreaking that it made the video even more powerful. Her full name was Elena Maria Vasquez. She was born in 1957 in a small apartment in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Her father worked in a factory. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families on the other side of the city. They had very little money, but they had something more valuable. They had love, and they had music. Elena's mother used to sing while she worked. Old songs from her grandmother's village. Tangos she had learned as a young woman. Lullabies that had been passed down through generations. Music was woven into the fabric of their home like threads in a blanket. When Elena was 5 years old, her mother took her to one of the houses she cleaned. It was a grand mansion owned by a retired opera singer. In the corner of the living room stood a beautiful piano. While her mother worked, little Elena wandered over to the instrument. She had never seen one up close before. She reached up and pressed a single key. The sound that came out seemed like magic to her. Pure and clear and full of possibility, the opera singer found her there an hour later, picking out a melody she had heard her mother hum. The old woman was astonished. This child had no training. She could not even read. Yet she was playing by ear with a natural talent that was unmistakable. The opera singer made a decision that day that would change Elena's life. She offered to pay for piano lessons. She saw something special in this little girl from a poor family, and she wanted to help it grow. For the next 12 years, Elena studied piano with some of the best teachers in Argentina. She practiced for hours every day, even when her fingers ached, even when she was exhausted from helping her mother with chores. Music had become her whole world. It was the first thing she thought about when she woke up and the last thing she dreamed about when she fell asleep. By the time she was 17, Elena was considered one of the most promising young pianists in South America. She had won competitions. She had performed with orchestras. Critics wrote glowing reviews, calling her a once-in-a-generation talent. The prestigious Conservatorio Nacional in Buenos Aires offered her a full scholarship. Her teachers spoke of international tours, recording contracts, a career that would take her to concert halls around the world. Everything was falling into place. All of her dreams were about to come true. And then the darkness came. In 1976, a military government seized power in Argentina. What followed was one of the most terrible periods in the country's history. Thousands of people disappeared. Families were torn apart. Anyone who spoke out against the government or was even suspected of opposing them could be taken in the night and never seen again. Elena's family was not political. They were simple people who wanted only to work and live in peace. But her father had a brother who had attended meetings with a student group. That was enough. In the eyes of the government, the whole family was guilty. They came for Elena's parents on a cold night in July. She was 19 years old. She had a recital the next morning, a performance that was supposed to launch her international career. Instead, she woke to the sound of boots on stairs and her mother's screams. She never saw her parents again. Elena ran. She had no choice. Friends hid her in basements and attics. She moved from place to place, never staying anywhere for more than a few weeks. The life she had known was gone. The piano she loved was gone. Everything was gone. For 2 years, she lived like a ghost. Then, when the immediate danger had passed, she emerged into a world that no longer had a place for her. The conservatory had erased her name from their records. The teachers who had praised her genius pretended not to know her. The doors that had once stood open were now firmly closed. She could have tried to rebuild her music career. Some people told her she should. But every time she looked at a piano, all she could see was her mother's face. All she could hear was her father's voice. The instrument that had once been her greatest joy had become a reminder of everything she had lost. So she stopped playing completely. She locked that part of herself away in a room deep inside her heart and threw away the key. She took work as a cleaning woman, just as her mother had done. She scrubbed floors and washed windows and made beds for people who never looked at her twice. She married a kind man who worked as a bus driver. They had a daughter together, then a granddaughter. She built a quiet life, small but full of love, and she never touched a piano again. Not once. Not for over 40 years. Until that day in Vienna, when the journalists published this story, the world wept. The video that had already touched millions of hearts now carried an entirely different weight. People watched it again with new eyes, understanding at last what they were seeing. This was not just a woman playing piano. This was a resurrection. This was a soul that had been buried for decades, finally clawing its way back to the surface. Every note Elena played in that hotel lobby was a cry of grief and a shout of triumph all at once. It was pain transformed into beauty. It was loss transformed into hope. The comments on the video changed. They became longer, more personal. People wrote about their own losses, their own buried dreams, their own locked rooms. Elena's story had given them permission to feel things they had hidden away for years, and in a small apartment across town, Elena sat with her granddaughter Sophia, watching the news coverage on television. She had not asked for any of this. She had not wanted to become famous. She had only wanted to visit her granddaughter and maybe, just maybe, see the city where Mozart once walked, but the world had other plans. Sophia held her grandmother's hand tightly. The phone had not stopped ringing all day. Interview requests? Concert invitations? Messages from people Elena had never met, telling her that her music had changed their lives. "What do you want to do, Abuela?" Sophia asked softly. Elena looked at the television screen. She saw herself sitting at that piano, eyes closed, fingers flying across the keys. She saw the woman she used to be. The woman she had thought was dead and gone forever. She took a deep breath. And for the first time in 40 years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future. "I want to play again," she whispered. "I want to play for them. For everyone who is still carrying pain they are afraid to feel. I want them to know that it is never too late." Sophia wrapped her arms around her grandmother and held her close, outside the window. The lights of Vienna sparkled like scattered diamonds. And somewhere in the distance, music was waiting. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The Vienna State Opera House is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. It has stood for over 150 years, surviving wars and fires and the endless march of time. The greatest musicians in history have performed on its stage. The greatest audiences have filled its red velvet seats. To play there is not just an honor, it is a dream that most pianists never achieve. 3 months after that afternoon in the hotel lobby, Elena Vasquez walked through the backstage entrance of this legendary hall. She moved slowly, taking in every detail. The worn wooden floors that had been crossed by so many famous feet. The faded posters on the walls advertising performances from decades past. The smell of dust and history and something else. Something like magic. Sophia walked beside her, holding her arm. The young woman had not left her grandmother's side since the video went viral. She had become Elena's protector, her translator, her bridge to a world that suddenly wanted to know everything about this extraordinary woman. The invitation had come 2 weeks after the hotel performance. The director of the Vienna State Opera had watched the video 17 times. He had wept each time. He called it the most moving thing he had ever witnessed. He wanted Elena to perform on his stage, not as a curiosity, not as a viral sensation, but as what she truly was. A world-class pianist who deserved to be heard. Elena had almost said no. The idea terrified her. Playing in a hotel lobby was one thing. Playing in one of the most prestigious concert halls on earth was something else entirely. What if she failed? What if the magic of that afternoon had been a one-time thing? What if she sat down at the piano and her fingers refused to remember? But then she thought about all the messages she had received. Thousands of them. From people all over the world. A woman in Japan who had given up painting after her husband died. A man in Brazil who had stopped singing after losing his job. A teenager in Norway who had hidden her poems in a drawer, afraid to share them with anyone. All of them wrote to tell Elena that her story had given them courage. That watching her play had made them believe that maybe, just maybe, it was not too late for them either. How could she say no? How could she turn back now when so many people were watching? When so many people needed to see that buried dreams could bloom again? So she said yes. The rehearsals had been difficult. Elena's hands were not as young as they used to be. Some days they ached so badly she could barely hold a cup of coffee. Some days her memory failed her, and passages she had known by heart suddenly seemed foreign. There were moments when she wanted to give up. Moments when the weight of what she was attempting felt too heavy to bear, but she kept going. Every morning she woke before dawn and practiced. Every night she fell asleep with music playing in her dreams. She pushed through the pain and the doubt and the fear, because she had made a promise, not just to the people who were waiting to hear her play, but to herself, to the young girl she had once been. to the parents who had believed in her, to everyone who had ever been told that their time had passed. And now, finally, the night had arrived. The concert hall was full. Every seat was taken. People had flown in from around the world just to be here. In the front row sat Sophia, her eyes already wet with tears. Beside her sat Klaus, the hotel manager who had mocked Elena 3 months ago. He had written her a long letter of apology and asked if he could attend. Elena had sent him a ticket with a simple note: "Everyone deserves a second chance." The house lights dimmed. The murmur of the crowd faded to silence. A single spotlight appeared on the empty stage, illuminating the grand piano that waited there like an old friend. Elena stepped out from the wings. The audience rose to their feet before she had taken 3 steps. The applause was thunderous. It rolled through the hall like a wave, crashing against the walls, filling every corner. People were cheering. Some were already crying. They had waited so long for this moment. They had traveled so far. And now here she was. The woman from the video. The woman who had reminded the world what music could do. Elena stopped at the edge of the spotlight. She looked out at the sea of faces. So many people. So much hope. So much love. She thought about her mother, who used to sing while she cleaned. She thought about her father, who had saved every coin to buy her sheet music. She thought about the opera singer who had heard a little girl pick out a melody and decided to change her life. She thought about all the years of silence, all the locked doors, all the music that had stayed trapped inside her. Waiting for this moment, she walked to the piano and sat down. The applause finally faded. The hall became perfectly still. 2,000 people held their breath. Elena placed her hands on the keys. She closed her eyes, and she began to play. She had chosen Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, the same piece she had played in the hotel lobby, the same piece that had started everything. But tonight, it sounded different, fuller, richer, more alive than ever before. The music poured out of her like water from a spring that had been blocked for decades. Every note carried the weight of her journey, the joy of her childhood, the promise of her youth, the horror of her loss, the long years of silence, and finally, miraculously, the return. She played not just with her fingers, but with her whole being. Her body swayed. Her face showed every emotion the music contained. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she did not stop. She could not stop. The music had her now, completely and forever. In the audience, people wept openly. Strangers held hands with strangers. Sophia pressed both palms against her heart, feeling it break and heal at the same time. Klaus stared at the stage with something like wonder, understanding at last what he had almost destroyed with his careless cruelty. The piece built toward its climax. Elena's hands moved with a speed and power that defied her age. Her years away from the piano, everything that should have made this impossible. She was not just playing the music. She was becoming it. She was finally, fully, completely herself. The final notes rang out through the hall. Elena lifted her hands from the keys. The sound faded slowly, like the last light of sunset disappearing below the horizon. For a moment, there was only silence, then the audience exploded. The applause was unlike anything the Vienna State Opera had heard in years. People stood on their seats. They shouted and cheered and cried. They threw flowers onto the stage. They called her name over and over again. Elena sat very still at the piano. She looked down at her weathered hands, the hands that had scrubbed so many floors, washed so many dishes, carried so many burdens. Tonight they had done something else. Tonight they had set her free. She looked up at the ceiling of the opera house, painted with angels and clouds, so much like the hotel lobby where this had all begun. She smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Not to the audience, to her parents, to her teachers, to everyone who had believed in her when she could not believe in herself. To the music that had waited so patiently for her return. She stood up slowly and faced the crowd. Sophia was already rushing toward the stage, tears streaming down her face. Elena opened her arms and caught her granddaughter in a tight embrace. The applause continued. It did not stop for a very long time, And in that moment, Elena Vasquez understood something important. Some dreams do not die. They only sleep. And sometimes, if you are brave enough, if you are patient enough, if you refuse to give up even when everything seems lost, they wake up again, stronger than ever, more beautiful than before, ready at last to be shared with the world.